No, it was just the way things happened, you know. It started off I didn't write, they wrote, then I started to write.
Hello, cinema enthusiasts. George Harrison. We all knew George Harrison as the quiet Beatle. But that silence was not peace. It was a 50-year prison. Before taking his final breath in 2001, George shattered the so-called sacred brotherhood that had left unhealed wounds in his soul, and he revealed the 5 people he hated most. In this video, we examine not only George's bandmates, but the 5 individuals who stabbed him in the back at his weakest moments. And especially the name at the very end of the list, the man George once called my brother, and the ultimate betrayal that left behind irreversible destruction, will be almost impossible to believe. If you're ready, let's begin. Number 1. John Lennon, the fake cowboy in makeup. At the top of the list is the man who was both George Harrison's idol and his executioner, John Lennon. When George first joined the band, he worshipped John like an older brother. But as George's talent grew, John never stopped treating him like an apprentice, humiliating him in front of everyone at every opportunity. It all began during Beatle studio sessions in the mid-1960s. When George brought in compositions he had worked on for months, John wouldn't even look at them, dismissing them with, "This is just trash." As George became increasingly interested in India and meditation, John mocked him in front of the entire band, sneering, "You and your gurus. It's all a scam." George stayed silent, but the knife inside him cut deeper every day. The breaking point came in 1973 in a New York hotel room. The Beatles were long gone. When John casually said, "Maybe someday we'll play together again," George exploded with 10 years of suppressed rage. He rushed forward, stared John in the eyes, and shouted, "Where were you when I needed you?" Then the unthinkable happened. George grabbed John's famous glasses, ripped them off his face, and smashed them onto the floor. For the first time, John Lennon was genuinely afraid of George Harrison. In that single moment, George exposed the narcissism hiding beneath John's fake peace and love persona. Conclusion. To George, John Lennon was a bully who denied his existence as an artist. Even years after John's death, George claimed he had forgiven him, but he could never erase the feeling of "you are not enough" that John carved into his soul. John remained at the very top of George's blacklist as the ultimate brotherly betrayal. Number 2. Paul McCartney, the dictator who silenced my guitar. Second on the list is the man George once said destroyed me as a guitarist, Paul McCartney. John's attacks were loud and brutal, but Paul's method was far more subtle and slow. Paul didn't see George as a musician, but merely as an instrument meant to play Paul's songs. During the Let It Be sessions, Paul hovered over George like a shadow. He dictated every note of George's solos, rejecting every attempt with, "No, play it exactly how I say." One day, in front of engineer Jeff Emmerich, George finally snapped and said, "I'll play whatever you want. I won't play at all if that's what you want." In that moment, George had already surrendered. The breaking point came in a 1987 interview. When asked if he would ever play in a band with Paul again, George replied without hesitation, "I'd play with John anytime, but never with Paul, because he never listens." This was George's final response to 20 years of control. Even masterpieces like Something were consistently pushed aside during the Beatles' era, slowly destroying George's confidence. Before his death, George openly exposed Paul's micromanaging and suffocating behavior, cracking his carefully cultivated nice guy image. Conclusion. To George, Paul McCartney was a dictator who sacrificed friendship for ambition. George never fully forgave Paul for trapping him in the role of the little brother and limiting his talent. Their silent, Cold War continued to ache in George's soul until his final breath. Number 3. Yoko Ono, the Biscuit and the Dark Shadow. Third on the list is Yoko Ono, whom George described as the dark shadow in the Beatles' studio. To George, Yoko wasn't just John's wife. She was a disruptive force who invaded the band's sacred space and pulled John away. This took place during the infamous Abbey Road sessions, when the band was already on the verge of collapse. John had placed a bed in the middle of the studio and laid Yoko on it, something George viewed as blatant disrespect. The breaking point came when Yoko reached for a biscuit sitting on top of a studio speaker and took one. Small as it seemed, it was the final straw. George shouted, "Those are my biscuits. Who do you think you are?" He was really directing his rage at John through Yoko. George despised Yoko's hypnotic influence over John and described her presence in the studio as the violation of art. Her distant and indifferent attitude toward George earned her a permanent place on his blacklist. Conclusion: George Harrison saw Yoko Ono as the primary culprit behind the Beatles' breakup. Even in his final years, he avoided speaking to her unless absolutely necessary. To George, Yoko was more than a woman. She was a dark barrier that came between friendship and music. Number 4. Alan Klein, Financial Betrayal and Ruin. Fourth is the man George called the real devil who destroyed the Beatles, manager Alan Klein. George trusted Klein and defended him against Paul. But by the time he realized Klein was a con man serving only himself, it was too late. Paul never trusted Klein, but George, John, and Ringo followed him anyway. Klein flattered George, whispering, "I'll make you a bigger star than John and Paul." Years later, George discovered how Klein had secretly exploited him through hidden contracts and funneled Beatles royalties into his own company. George responded by launching brutal lawsuits, calling Klein the biggest rat Hollywood has ever seen. Klein cost George not only his money, but also his friendship with Paul. Conclusion: George Harrison considered Alan Klein the biggest strategic mistake of his life. Before his death, he described him as a man who sold his soul to the devil. To George, Klein wasn't just a manager. He was a poison that turned brothers against each other. Number 5. Eric Clapton, the ultimate betrayal of a best friend. We now arrive at the most complex and devastating name on George Harrison's blacklist, Eric Clapton. Eric was George's closest friend, his soulmate. But Eric fell in love with George's wife, Pattie Boyd, turning George's life into a tragic love triangle. Eric and George shared everything, constantly playing together. Eric turned his obsession with Pattie into the legendary song Layla. George sensed it, but his love for Eric blinded him. The breaking point came when Eric looked George in the eyes inside his own home and said, "I love your wife, and I'm going to take her from you." It was the ultimate humiliation. George didn't fight. He didn't shout. He simply handed Eric his guitar and said, "Let's play." But from that day on, Eric was branded a thief in George's eyes. Though George later divorced Pattie and appeared to remain friends with Eric, he confessed privately, "Eric stole my heart, not my guitar." That George wrote something for Pattie ensured that every time Eric heard the song, he was forced to remember George's pain. Conclusion: George Harrison always regarded Eric Clapton as his favorite enemy. Though he ended the silent war before his death, Eric's betrayal permanently shattered George's trust in life. Eric entered history as the emotional killer on George's blacklist. When George Harrison left this world on November 29, 2001, he taught us one thing above all. Silence does not mean forgiveness. John's ego, Paul's control, Yoko's shadow, Klein's theft, and Eric's betrayal. George carried all these names on his blacklist and walked toward peace with their weight on his soul. What do you think? Was George Harrison a genius wasted in the glittering world of the Beatles? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to explore the hidden world of legends. See you in the next video.